Welcome to Within the Frame, where we delve into the most up-to-date stories across the globe. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. Amid rising conflicts across many parts of the world, the two-day NATO Defense Ministers Meeting kicked off in Brussels on Thursday. Defense chiefs from 32 member states are to discuss ways to strengthen deterrence, support war-stricken Ukraine, and foster cooperation with global partners. The latest event will be a special occasion, especially for South Korea, as the so-called IP4 nations, South Korea, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, have been invited to join for the very first time. So what are the major points of discussion, and what would be South Korea's biggest takeaway? For answers to this, we are joined by Robert Kelly, Professor for International Relations at Pusan National University. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And also joining us will be Kim Young-jun, Professor of National Security College at the Korea National Defense University. Great to have you, Professor, too.
Thank you. Hello from Tokyo.
So, Professor Kelly, the official outcomes are yet to be released, but what could be the key agenda items for this meeting?
Well, I think it's almost certainly going to be dominated by Ukraine, right? The Ukraine war has gone on a lot longer, really, I think, than anybody anticipated, certainly more than the Russians anticipated. One of the arguments Donald Trump has used to power his campaign is that he can finally bring this thing to an end, which seems to be the consensus in the West. Everybody seems to want to get around this because they're worried about nuclear escalation and things like that. So I'd imagine, to the extent that this is mostly a NATO event, of course, right, but for the IP4, that a lot of the focus will be on the Ukraine war. And as you said in your intro, right, I mean, how can we support Ukraine? A lot of the Eastern European states in NATO continue to really want to support Ukraine. They want some kind of, if not full victory, they want to at least push the Russians out of what's been occupied since 2022. And so I think there'll be a big discussion inside NATO, probably, I'm sort of speculating here, but probably between the defense ministers of East and West within Europe, right, about how much exactly we should be supporting the Ukrainians. And then to the extent that the Asian ministers are coming too, right, that's sort of new, as you mentioned, right, and then I think there will be pressure on them, right, are you going to be part of this? Do you want to help or not, right? We know that South Korea, for example, has sort of transshipped shells through the United States to support the Ukrainians, particularly last year in the offensive. And there will be, I think, a fair amount of jockeying to see what the Asian allies, these sort of semi-NATO partners now, what they think about the Ukraine war. Do they want to continue to support Ukraine? You know, does Japan and Korea want the war to end, or they think that Ukraine should push for some kind of victory, right? I think that's probably what it will dominate it. You know, there'll be larger sort of questions too, terrorism and the war in the Middle East and things like that, but I think the overwhelming focus will be on the war in Ukraine.
Right, largely on the war in Ukraine. But before we get into the details, as you've mentioned, for the first time, the so-called IP4 has been invited to the meeting. Professor Kim, what significance and context does this invitation hold?
Yes, NATO always welcome IP4 country, and it's want to have some support from Indo-Pacific country for the Russian-Ukraine war. At the same time, NATO really want to have some kind of an important role, especially in the Pacific area against China, the one of the strongest challenge against NATO. So in this context, so-called IP4, South Korea, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand is a very important partner for NATO. At the same time, NATO want to share a value alliance with this partner. So this is a great partnership between the NATO and IP4, not just in the Atlantic or separated in the Pacific region, but at the same time, they share value in saving international liberal order against the strongest challenge like Russia, China, and North Korea. So this is a very important partnership, but at the same time, they just don't want to have a slogan. They just want to have to work together in more detail. So this defense minister meeting is a very important turning point, not just slogan, but they want to have some detailed job together.
Right. So in this wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Professor Kelly, what is the current state of relations between Russia and North Korea, as well as Russia-China alliance? How is the tight-knit relationship between the three perceived internationally?
Yeah, so the question of what exactly the Russians are giving the North Koreans and vice versa, right? That's a topic for enormous speculation, right? There's a lot of concern that the Russians, who are desperate for ammunition, are going to give the Russians some kind of reentry technology for its missiles, or guidance technology or something like that, right? Or miniaturization technology. You know, we know the North Koreans have an ICBM. We know the North Koreans need to lighten it. They need to build smaller payloads to put on top of those, strike the United States. The Russians have that kind of technology. There's a lot of anxiety about that, right? Of course, we don't know, right? Because obviously the Russians and the North Koreans aren't going to tell us this kind of stuff. But certainly the relationship is closer than it's been in a while. The Russians are now facilitating the full violation of UN sanctions, right? They sank the expert committee on the sanctions oversight earlier this year. Presumably Russian banks, which are being closed out of Western operations, are going to be wide open for the North Koreans to sort of do their various corruption and elite money schemes and whatnot through them, right? And so, I think the Russians and North Koreans, if only because they're both pariahs, will be a lot closer in the future, right? I mean, Russia will not be normalized as long as Putin is still president. So I think the Russian-North Korea relationship has a while to go, probably at least a decade. I think the larger question you brought up is a really good one, though, right? Which is, to what extent are Russia, China, and North Korea, and perhaps Iran cooperating now with some kind of alliance or some kind of group, right? I mean, there's a lot of talk now about an alliance of authoritarianism or an axis of authoritarianism, right? People remember the axis from the 30s and 40s, and they think, is this sort of the same thing? It's tough to know, right? Because we just don't know to what extent they're variously supporting one another. There are rumors of North Korean soldiers going to fight in Russia against the Ukrainians. That would be a big step forward to this group becoming more than just like a gang and actually becoming some kind of alliance. I think the real core marker to watch for that, though, is not Russia, North Korea, and Iran, all of whom are pariahs, all of whom are isolated and reckless, right? It's really China. Because if China really gets behind the revisionist efforts of the Russians and the North Koreans and so on, the Chinese have the most to lose, because they're the most heavily integrated into the world system, right? They benefit substantially from their participation in the WTO. They benefit substantially from their access to Western markets. And if the Chinese really throw their weight behind North Korea and Russia and Iran to a certain extent, perhaps in the conflict in the Middle East, that will really, really accelerate the decoupling that's already begun between China and many of its trade partners, right? So I think China is the one to watch of those four rogue states.
Right, so we'll have to keep close eyes on China's next moves. Now, going back to the IP4, the IP4 has been invited to NATO summit and foreign ministers meetings for 3 consecutive years. Could this suggest that the IP4 is effectively securing a quasi-member status within NATO, Professor Kelly?
Yes, Professor Kelly already pointed out the IP4 country members of the NATO. So this is a significant point for the IP4 country as a quasi-member status with the NATO. And at the same time, this is very important for NATO and at the same time for IP4, because Russia and Ukraine are showing the Russia and Ukraine not just impact on the European theater, but global issue. And at the same time, a Taiwan contingency scenario is a kind of the red line in saving liberal international order, not just a regional issue, not just in the Pacific issue. So NATO is really want to have a role kind of against possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and IP4 is a very important partner against that. So this is not just a regional partnership in Europe for NATO and in the Pacific for the IP4. This is the global the membership as a value alliance in saving liberal democracy, human rights against the dictatorship country like China, Russia, North Korea. So yes, my answer is IP4 already quasi-member status within NATO.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Professor Kelly? Do you agree that IP4 has become a bigger influence to NATO?
Yeah, definitely, right? I think that NATO has been sort of looking increasingly towards China, particularly as the Chinese are providing a lot of assistance to the Russians in the war, right? We know that China has provided a lot of financial assistance and maybe providing dual-use assistance. Again, we don't really know because obviously the Russians and the Chinese aren't going to tell us this stuff, but there's a great deal of suspicion out there, and there's some data to support that, right? We know that the Russian ruble, for example, is not collapsed, which is almost certainly because of economic support out of the Chinese. And to the extent that Russia or China is providing the lifeblood of these various challengers, North Korea, Iran, and Russia, right? China is increasingly the focus, right, of liberal democracies everywhere, right? I mean, ultimately, NATO is just an organization. What really matters, as Dr. Kim said, right, is that we all sort of share the same basic values, right? I mean, whether you're Australia or Italy or Korea or whatever, right? And we're all basically liberal democracies concerned about these authoritarian states on the move. And to the extent that Russia and China are coordinating, you're going to see the democracies coordinate more. You know, I mean, the Biden people, if I recall, the Biden people originally 4 or 5 years ago were talking about we're going to have like an alliance of democracies. That kind of didn't really work. But if the IP4 starts to show up at NATO on a regular basis, you're basically getting the same thing, right? And I would imagine that there are probably efforts to reach out to democracies in Latin America and elsewhere to try to create a sort of larger network because, you know, it looks like China is funding this sort of big challenge, and that's going to provoke a response, which is what this is.
Mm-hmm. With that being said, Professor Kim, during the meeting, what kind of practical areas of cooperation do you anticipate NATO to discuss, particularly with IP4?
Yes, I have been working with the Minister of National Defense now, the Vice Minister of MMD participating in the NATO Defense Meeting. And many issues like defense industry collaboration or expanded military training are example for the discussing issue between the NATO and the IP4 because, for example, South Korea is one of the top countries to export defense industry, and also Australia and Japan is one of the advanced country to having like AI or the other technology power. And also at the same time, NATO really want to join expanded joint military training in the Pacific area, so they need a partnership, and the U.S. lead NATO and also IP4 need for the having combined military exercise against the South China Sea issue or Taiwan contingency issue, even North Korean issue. So many issues like this kind of a defense industry collaboration between NATO, IP4, and expanded military training are important area for discussion.
Right. So we have been emphasizing the role of China as we held our discussion. In its 2022 new strategic concept, NATO identified China as a threat for the very first time. Professor, what role might South Korea play in NATO's efforts to counter China if military cooperation would be on the table? What kind of impact do you think this would have on Seoul's relationship with Beijing, Professor Kim?
Yes, this is a kind of dilemma for South Korea. We have to have a good relation with the NATO and commitment to Russian-Ukraine war. At the same time, we have to manage the relation between China and South Korea because China is an important trading partner, and we need any Chinese support for solving North Korean issue. So this is a very difficult dilemma for South Korea. But anyway, we can do that. We can have a both good relation with the NATO and China because NATO partnership not just about the China or Taiwan contingency, but it's about Russian-Ukraine war or North Korean military threat, or at the same time in saving the international order, rule-based order. So we can try to having a NATO partnership. At the same time, we have to manage the relation with China as one of the largest trading partner.
What about you, Professor Kelly? How can South Korea balance its commitments to NATO with its relationship with China and North Korea, especially in light of the current geopolitical landscape?
Yeah, that's like the big question for South Korean grand strategy for the next 20 years. So we could be here all night, right? I mean, South Korea has been trying to figure out a way to walk between the raindrops between the U.S. and China, you know, between authoritarian states and democratic states for a while, right? A lot of that is just because of South Korea's unfortunate geography. You live next to 3 autocracies. I mean, you have to find a way to live with North Korea, Russia, and China because they're on your doorstep. And of course, as Dr. Kim mentioned, also, China is now a big trading partner for South Korea. And I think ultimately what the South Korean government's going to have to do is I don't think there are any big immediate steps. I think instead the South Korean government's going to have to sort of go through a big debate about what exactly to do, build some kind of consensus, at least between right and left, between the 2 big parties in Korea, about how to respond to this. So the Yoon government, for example, has begun to emphasize decoupling from China. It has encouraged South Korean businesses to go elsewhere, and the United States has now resumed its position as South Korea's #1 export target. It was China, I think, for about 15 years and became the U.S. just again last year. It's that kind of stuff. It's going to take a while. I think there will also be discussion and interest in whether or not South Korea's defense industrial base, which was mentioned is pretty big, right, can help provide support for Ukraine again in the future, right, or can provide, you know, sort of cheaper munitions and weapons in Southeast Asia, right, because of the Chinese pressure on the South China Sea. So I think there's some things that South Korea can do, but it's going to have to manage this deftly with China, although I will say I don't think in the long term South Korea is going to be able to do both. You can think of it as like a Venn diagram, and the ice between the, with South Korea living on the space between the U.S. and China. I think eventually that's going to dissipate. Unless, Xi Jinping, my sense is that Xi Jinping is pretty belligerent now about what China's foreign policy goals are in regarding Taiwan and Southeast Asia, and at some point he's going to push. He's 71, which means his mortality is an issue. I would imagine there will be some kind of Chinese move in Southeast Asia in the next 10 to 15 years. And South Korea, like a lot of other countries, Australia, the Philippines, and so on, is going to have to make a choice. I think South Korea's done a good job of putting that choice off, right? And that's wise to do. But I think that choice is ultimately unavoidable. And one of the things I argue a lot at conferences in South Korea is that South Korea should start laying the groundwork by having a big debate about this now. Like, what are you guys going to do if there's a conflict over Taiwan? Like, I don't know, right? I'm not really sure South Korea really knows. And I think that's what needs to happen, is there just needs to be a big discussion about, like, what do we want to do? How far do we want to go? If the Americans fight this thing, do we want to join them 100%? Or maybe only 50% because we don't want to participate in what could become a nuclear war? I don't really know what the right answer is, but I think there's a lot of grand strategy thinking that needs to be done in South Korea, and a lot of it will be done behind closed doors, not to provoke China, but some of it's got to be done in public, because South Korea is a democracy, and the South Korean public has to be ready for this choice. It can't just happen like the Cuban Missile Crisis or something. There needs to be, I would argue, there should be some kind of public discussion of, like, what do you do in this awkward position you're in between, the dictatorships and the democracies.
Right, so we will have to make a decision at some point.
I think so.
Yes, and at the suggestion of Australia, there will also be a separate meeting among IP4 nations. And this marks a significant occasion, as it will be the first time these 4 countries meet without other NATO members. Professor Kelly, what does Australia want, and what are they likely to discuss?
Yeah, so I actually think it's great that the East Asian defense ministers are meeting, right? I mean, it's too bad you can't have the Filipinos and others in there too, right? I mean, there are a lot of other states worried about China, not just the 4 that are showing up. But I would imagine, I mean, these are the most robust democracies in China's sort of maritime perimeter, and I think that's why they were invited. I think there's going to be a lot of focus on freedom of operation, freedom of navigation in South China Sea. That's obvious, right? A lot of these, Japan and South Korea get their oil from the Persian Gulf through the South China Sea, so free transit there is an issue, right? We know that the Australians and the New Zealanders have participated in transit near Taiwan. That's probably the other big issue, right? Most of the security strategic issues are maritime, so I'd imagine that there's focus there. But also, I would imagine a lot of it is just trying to sort of put the groundwork together for these 4 to talk to each other. It's not really clear to me that Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia have any kind of like running, standing operation, right, where they're regularly communicating with each other about issues of importance like missile defense. So I would imagine that a lot of what it is just sort of saying, should we do this again? Like, what would it look like? Should we have some kind of like sub-ministerial meeting or something like that? Should we be sharing intelligence data or satellite data? I would imagine a lot of that basic groundwork just doesn't exist, and so there will be a lot of that to start with.
Right, so more discussions will be coming.
Yeah, always talking.
Now, as Professor Kelly mentioned a while ago, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has emphasized prioritizing support for Ukraine is one of the major topics. He could ask for support from partner nations like Seoul, and given that South Korea has not provided lethal aid to Ukraine, Professor Kim, do you think there could be changes to South Korea's decision?
In conclusion, first, no big change. And I know Zelensky made the argument the North Korean soldier found in the Ukraine war, surprisingly, and this is not right thing. And some media news Putin really want to have a 3,000 North Korean soldier unit or something like that. And NATO Secretary General also emphasized that this is not a good thing. But yeah. South Korea are really concerned about this, and nobody expected those Korean soldiers participating actually in the war zone. But this will be not a big change for South Korean position in sending little aid or something like that, because everybody wants to stop the war, but at the same time, the U.S. presidency election is coming just 3 weeks away, and we need to wait some who will be the U.S. leader and how the Russian-Ukraine war will going after this November. So will really the support Ukraine. At the same time, North Korean soldier funding is a terrible, terrible issue. But at the same time, South Korean position will be no big change at the moment, and we need to have some type of a new leadership of the White House, and we will collaborate lately, accordingly, after this November.
Right, so no dramatic change in South Korea's point. Meanwhile, Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba is advocating for an Asian version of NATO. Professor Kim, what is the feasibility of this initiative, and what does Ishiba want to pursue through this?
Yeah, now everybody talk about Prime Minister Ishiba's the vision on NATO. So many Japanese colleagues of mine, and maybe Professor Kelly's friend in Japan maybe share this will be not easy for making NATO in the Pacific area. But anyway, the Prime Minister Ishiba suggests this issue, and he didn't mention how many countries during this. Maybe 3 countries will be possible for NATO. But NATO membership is all about the automatic the intervention when somebody is invaded by other countries. So this is not easy. But anyway, Prime Minister Ishiba seriously suggested this vision when he became the prime minister. So maybe after this election in Japan, maybe we can talk about it, and we need anyway a U.S. partnership for this one. So maybe this will be looks like very difficult issue, and many people oppose it. But we need to open anything for making NATO in Asia or something like that. So we don't know yet, but this is very interesting, and in some way this is a good idea against a challenge like China, Russia, and North Korea in this region.
All right. I'm afraid we will have to conclude our discussion at this point, gentlemen. Thank you so much for your insights and your time tonight. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Very much.
Now that wraps up our program for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow at 8:30 p.m. Korea time. Until then, goodbye.